Time now for our Sunday group. GOP strategist Karl Rove, incoming House Republican Conference Chair Liz Cheney, and columnist for The Hill, Juan Williams. Karl, I think it's fair to say that President Bush was a classic moderate Republican. He negotiated bipartisan compromises such as the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 1990, he negotiated a budget deal, which may have cost him his presidency because in order to cut the deficit, he broke his pledge, no new taxes. How different is the Washington of George Bush in terms of the idea of legislating, compromising from the Washington of today?
Well, I think it's somewhat different, but in that respect. But I think it's really different in the tone that he set. I mean, he was of that greatest generation, and there was a humility and a respect and a decency about him that sometimes is not seen frequently in Washington today. His best friend in Congress was Lud Ashley, a Democrat from Akron, Ohio. And he had friendships across the aisle based on, shared background, shared experiences in the time that they were together. And we don't see that much in Washington anymore.
You know, it's interesting, Liz, when I asked your dad the question about iron ass, I was a little nervous about it, but he gave such a great answer, and it was so revealing about President Bush because, yes, he expressed his opinion, but on the other hand, it wasn't personal, and he reached out and also made a show of sitting together with your dad at the Alfalfa Club dinner.
Well, let me just say that I am a proud member of Team Iron Ass Chris. And, but President Bush, I was struck both by that story, but also by the piece where he was, talking about the soldier in Desert Storm. And I think that the emotion that he showed in terms of how proud he was and how moved he was of America and of our military. And I think that's something that really helps when you're talking about bipartisanship, is just getting back to remembering the fundamental goodness and greatness of somebody like George Bush, but also of our military, of our men and women in uniform. And that's something we all should remember and be able to come around.
I want to get back, Juan, to the original question that I asked Karl. You and I had the great good fortune to cover Presidents Reagan and Bush back in the 80s. And to me now, it seems like a different world in terms of government's ability, the leaders in government of the various different factions, to come together, to compromise, and to solve our problems.
No question, Chris. We live in a polarized political age today, so divided. You know, the way I think of it, Chris, is sort of optimism versus pessimism. Mourning in America, a kinder, gentler America versus American carnage, as a message coming from the leader to the American people. So when I think of President Bush, I think of someone who crossed the aisle. You know, I was really taken by what Karl just said about his best friend being a Democrat and while he served those 2 terms in Congress. And of course, he followed Reagan's pronouncement, 11th commandment, speak no evil of another Republican, versus Donald Trump, who has a polarizing relationship with Democrats, clearly fractured, but also attacks other Republicans who don't agree or embrace him. And again, I think also of policy issues like guns. You know, after Oklahoma City in '95, President Bush quit the NRA, quit his lifetime membership. After what happened in Parkland, Florida, you see President Trump not only say that we should arm teachers, but continue to do business with the NRA.
I'm not sure, Liz, that I would go along with the attack on President Trump, because frankly, not to say that he doesn't make mistakes and hasn't done some things wrong, but I think there's culpability on all sides here. And that's the question I have for you is the perception that Washington has become a zero-sum game where all sides, Democrats, Republicans, the White House, feel I only win if the other side loses? Is that fair? And is it fair to say that this polarization is preventing us from addressing our problems and dealing with them?
Well, I've really missed Juan. I forgot how much. But look, we are very polarized. I mean, one thing that's true, though, is that, I can speak for, on the floor of the House of Representatives, there isn't venom all the time. And I've found that you can go sit down next to anybody from any party. They've got an interesting story, and they're good people there for the right reasons. Now, it is the truth, however, that we have big issues. You know, we have a lot of Democrats now coming in who are socialists. That's not an, you know, I'm not exaggerating. They are socialists, and I think that it's very important that we actually do have very aggressive and clear policy debates. We got to make sure that we understand the grave national security threat that's out there, as well as the threat that we're facing from the perspective of our debt, and the socialist set of agendas, set of issues, which I think Leader Pelosi is probably going to be compelled to have to push forward, are ones that would be disastrous for the nation. So I think we've got to fight, and fight hard on those issues.
I think that Juan is going to say he missed you.
There's no question. We've known each other for quite a while.
Let's try to end this on a more personal note. Carl, when you and I, before the show began, you were saying that George H.W. Bush changed the arc of your life. I mean, what did this man mean to you?
Great, make me cry on national television. I went to work for him when I was in my early 20s, and the rest of my life is a result of being associated with him. And you know, he taught me what it was like what the kind of person I had to strive to be. Anybody who was around George Bush came to love him and admire him, and to try and emulate him. He was a kind and gentle and decent person. He's also strong and principled, with great convictions and character and integrity. And when you're around him, you wanted to emulate those things. You know, look at that incredible life that he had. And Jim Baker put his finger on a big part of it. The fearlessness of a kid who grows up in privilege in the East, and his father's a bigwig in a Wall Street firm, Brown Brothers Harriman, and he says, like so many Americans, I'm going to strike out for the West, and I'm going to learn the oil business from the bottom up, and I'm going to strike a new life. If you go to Midland, Texas, and see the modest house, it's not bigger than the stage that we're sitting on here that he lived in Midland. And he jumped into politics as a Republican when they hunted Republicans in Texas with dogs. And then he served our country so well in so many great positions, and he did so. You talk to people who had a chance to work with him, whether it was at the CIA or in China or as vice president or wherever in the oil patch, and they admired him because he was not only a very great man, he was a very good man.
And let me just quickly, because we're running out of time, Liz, any personal remembrance of this man, any dealing that you had with him, either directly or through your dad?
Well, I just remember election night in 2004 up in the residence of the White House when President Bush, 41, saw my daughter, Kate, and walked over to her, and he said, "You're the youngest person here, and I'm the oldest person, and we need to sit together tonight." And he sat there, the two of them together in an armchair, you know, deep in conversation.
And it must have meant a lot to him, because that was the second term that he never got, but his son did get.
He was a great and good man, and as Carl said, somebody whom we should all strive to
Juan, 30 seconds.
Well, you know, I traveled with him, especially in '94 for the Reagan re-election, and one of the things that struck me, Chris, was he wrote notes every day to lots of people, knew them as human beings, had a relationship. So he's asking you for something. It wasn't that it was the first call. He was asking because he knew you and you knew him. And I got to say, to reassert what Carl just said, one of the kindest, most loving people, self-effacing.
Thank you, panel, and we'll see you all next week back in Washington. Up next.